many ways, the human resource issues are the toughest issues for us. The foundation has always had the belief that its only resources were its human resources.
The staff resources in a foundation are one of the important components in making it all work, sometimes even more important than the financial resources in terms of service and work with projects that are being supported.
With a relatively small staff, we had a full-time HR person who was basically a combination advocate for the staff, assistant to staff on benefits, and as we began to shrink, getting ready for 2016, that position had to go. So in losing the support positions, we become even more aware of the human resource implications of a spend down.
As we approached the end of funding, we encouraged the staff to be looking. We helped them look. We helped place some in projects that had been developed within the foundation's time frame. And we partially funded, fully funded and then partially funded staff as they moved into a project to take it over. So again, and then we guaranteed that everybody would have a cushion in terms of the transition, but it was designed in a special package for each individual. The main question is no surprises.
In terms of letting the staff know in Canada, Israel, and the States, we began that process back in 2007, 2008, when we announced to the staff in each of the locations and publicly the 2016 date. It was not a surprise that we were spending down, and because we are an operating foundation, many of our projects were designed to be sustainable without us.
I would say 5 years before we were ready really to close the operation, we began spending a great deal more time with projects and with our staff working with projects to help them consider what they had to be doing to keep their programs alive and to find other funding.
As one gets closer to that date, and it's amusing when the date was set in 2015. In 2001, one of the reasons we set that date was it was 15 years off and seemed like a long time. Wrong about that. We see more and more manifestations of it, especially as it affects our personnel.
The staff are very important resources to the foundation, but also to the general public and certainly the projects that are being supported.
I would only add, in addition to that, too often people think of foundations only as that pile of money. And yet, when you have a staff that has been working in an area for a number of years, the foundation may be closing, but they're continuing to work in that area. And they continue to be resources. And for many years past the actual closing of the foundation, they will be making contributions in the fields in which they've been working. And that's also rewarding to interpret to the staff, that they too shouldn't fall into the trap of thinking, oh, the money ends, therefore everything ends. The programs go on, and their contributions go on in long and important careers.
There is a sense of loss in terms of the day-to-day collegiality and so forth, and various ways to get around that in terms of keeping in touch with people who've gone on to something else before the final closing, and that can be done, you know, over lunch or informal dinner.
Clearly there's a sense of loss, but we're not a great example of that because many of the staff will continue in the family office. We have both the family office and a foundation co-located. It's not a, you know, it's not as if the neutron bomb will have hit here in 2016, and that changes the dynamic somewhat. And I would add only one other thing, and that we shouldn't discount the peer relationships among the staff themselves. I recently got a note from a staff person who does not report to me to express her concern about another staff person's anxiety. They had been out to lunch together. And I really appreciate it. I was not as aware as I should have been about that anxiety, and we're now working that through.
Retaining people would suggest that you give them an incentive so that they're not feeling they're going to be cut off or have a more difficult than anticipated transition.
That dynamic is not so different than the dynamic that exists in other nonprofits and in businesses indeed. There are times when some divisions are shrinking while you're hiring staff in another division. And it can be very frustrating and confusing to staff, but it is not exclusive to the Spend Down Foundation.
Mm-hmm. We hired people as consultants, understanding that it was a short-term or a limited-term commitment. We were sometimes a bit more generous in terms of how that affected either payment or a wind down, and sometimes a follow-up. It was a way of protecting us all the way around.
In some ways, there's an irony in the question about motivation, which is when you have a date certain by which your work is going to be completed, at least in that setting, there's a lot to do. And you know, I find myself more energized and more motivated and more focused than I would otherwise be.
For other foundations that have a perpetual commitment, the suggestion would be to take a segment of their resources, staff and money, over a 10-year period and really go gangbusters in a program area and whatnot and do something different with a time frame. That's an interesting challenge.
Spend Down is not a demotivating issue. It is a real issue of focus.
There is an important question about institutional memory and how to pass that on or preserve it. The easiest part of it is to put the files into a public archive. Aaron Diamond foundations are at the New York Public Library.
And in many ways, I think the information age makes the question of institutional memory much easier. We've put all of our publications on the web, and we'll sustain the website long after our closing. As an operational foundation, we have 9 incubated projects that will continue and carry our work in their entities as long as they're meeting a need. Indeed, I think many foundations would have their work enhanced by having more experienced people from the field to bring a field perspective to the work of the foundation.
It should not be a power dynamic. Yes, we have a lot of power, but if we're not careful, the danger is too long in this work produces arrogance and intellectual corruption. And it's a disaster. It ill-serves everybody, even the person who becomes so affected because they develop ulcers or other problems. And they're really not happy people. Now, of course, our dynamic is how do you work with them and get people to move on and so forth. But it's part of a regular review of people's work, whether they're spend down or not. Are you enjoying this? Are you effective at it? How well do you work with the team? Some people are good in teams, some people aren't. And a respectful candor. It's a very difficult, sometimes, balance to keep, but it's absolutely essential.
I think most of it, most of this journey of the spend down is filled with emotion, but for me it's been an emotion of joy. because of the focus of the time limitation, I'm working more closely with those grantees and those projects we incubated, and can see more clearly the progress that has been made in the fields in which we operated. And that's enormously rewarding. Yes, there are the moments of sadness to see colleagues leave, and there are moments of reflection, because in our case, our plans were made with Andrea Bronfman surviving Charles, and yet she predeceased him. And many of the plans that we had were changed when that happened. And I think in so many ways, foundations are reflective of life and run the gamut of all of the emotions of life. And those of us who are privileged to be in positions of leadership have the opportunity to tweak those moments and tweak them for the better.
It's seeing things that have happened with the help of the resources, personal and financial, from a foundation. And I think looking back over a career, now at a senior stage of it, the joy and the satisfaction of encountering people that I told no 35 years ago, but gave them a suggestion that they remember I might have forgotten. And that kind of ongoing participation in a community of ideas and achievement and work to benefit the community is incredibly rewarding.
The staff shouldn't be getting the shocks from decisions that are sometimes made hastily and without full thought. And that's part of the job of the senior manager.